So decided to get a bit of electronic mapping done on the bike this year. Thought it'd be worth showing some people about what that process looks like, why I went for a custom remap or flash over a postal one, and show you a little bit about what goes on behind the scenes during that particular process. This particular bike has been set up by Gary Donoghue out in Moto Tuning. You'll get all of his details about what's going on in this video on mototuning.ie. So today we're out in a place in Santry, Dublin called DLM, or Danny Lyons Motorcycles. It's where the dyno is. It's where Gary comes to set up all of the bikes that he custom maps. Here you'll see a bike with another customer up on the bench getting some jetting work done, and you'll see the Tracer that I've got today, the 2015 one, over on the bench getting stripped down because the control unit, the ECU that we're working on today, it lives underneath the tank, so we need to get some quick access to it. This baldy guy here, this is Gary Donoghue, the handsome chap who's doing all of the work on the bike today. He's just in getting ready before the bike goes up on the road for its first baseline reading of the day. And this bike got brought here because it was really snatchy low down in the revs. And what surprised me was the baseline reading. So you'll see it getting set up here on the dyno. You see all the air stuff going on. This is a really kind of sophisticated modern dyno that they've got here. One of the best in the business. And at the moment you'll see Gary just plugging in all of the different connectors for the Yamaha loom, all of the diagnostics and the rev counter and all that kind of stuff. But what I mentioned a minute ago is that what really surprised me is that after this baseline reading was performed, and you'll see the graph in a moment, it was perfectly smooth. And I always suspected that this bike had a flat spot or had something wrong with it low in the revs, because when you roll off the throttle between 3 and maybe 5,000 RPM and then reopen it with small or medium throttle position, it's snatchy. And if you did that when the bike was banked over, you were upsetting the suspension mid-corner. And I always presumed when I see a map I'll be able to put my finger on it and say, there's the problem. But that wasn't the case, and this was the real eye-opener for me with mapping today, is because those graphs that you see, they're being performed with the throttle 100% wide open, which is practically where I never ride this bike. It's always mid-position. Anyway, I'll talk about that a bit later. Here you can see Gary clicking the bike up and through the box. He's getting some baseline readings, checking that everything is correct on it. And while this is happening, it's pretty loud when you're in this room. The fans are going crazy. Obviously the bike is getting high up in the revs, so it's kind of loud as well. You'll see everyone covered up with earphones, just trying to protect their ears. And really interesting seeing how careful they are about the calibration on these dynos. Every single month they go in and do some recalibration exercises. There's all different sensors around the room to adjust for the temperature and pressure and so on as well. So once you've got a reading off a single dyno, go back to the dyno if you want to get a comparative reading. The other thing we noticed here is that in top gear, the Tracer was actually bouncing off a Yamaha enforced speed limiter. So the baseline reading we took was 1 gear down from top. I think probably, there's actually the graph now, and you'll see it's perfectly smooth. I think the baseline reading, I presume it's a 6-speed box, and the Tracer was probably taken in 5th gear. Here the bike is going back up on the bench now to get some diagnostic information out of the loom, to do with any of the information that the bike itself can tell the other laptop. And this is going through the exercises here. And notice on the dyno laptop, the one on the left of your screen here, there's 3 gauges. There's rev and speed, as you'd expect, but the one in the middle is the most interesting. It's the air to fuel ratio gauge, and this is really why this bike was turned out to be snatchy. Yamaha, to get these bikes through the emissions, make them run lean, not enough fuel at low RPM, and you can see that later using that air to fuel mixture. And once that's recognized, then it's back to the laptop here. Plug the ECU into it, get a connector out of this box so that you can make it work, and then work on the map. In the case of this bike, it was given a little bit more fuel in certain parts of the rev range, which is actually better for the bike. The bike runs cooler when it's running slightly rich. But the reason Yamaha would leave it running lean is so that they can easily get through those strict regulations of emissions controls, which is often to the detriment of the bike, by the way. And that's why there's often some really easy, quick wins with these ECUs getting remapped as well. The good news for people with a Tracer is that now that this bike has been up on the bench with a baseline setting, standard air filter, standard pipe, were you to ship another ECU to Gary, he'll be quickly able to put on the same learnings that this bike got onto your ECU and ship it straight back. So in this video I'm showing the process happening once. Get a baseline, pull out the ECU, get a power reading. In practice that happened 3 or 4 times. The bike was on and off the bench quite a bit, but I didn't think it would be as interesting for the video, so I've shortened it to just one stint. The bike's now going back on the bench to get its hopefully improved reading, and I mentioned a minute ago that they happen at 100% throttle, which is a very vague way of getting a power reading. So what they're able to do on this dyno is they're actually able to say, right, well, they know the problem that I'm feeling is between, let's say, 3 and 5,000 RPM. So they're able to press some buttons on the dyno and put some weight into that wheel, I presume, and it actually does like a hold test or a stop test. I can't remember exactly what it does, but the machine itself will make the bike spend longer in a certain rev range so that they can really get into more detail. It's like putting a magnifying glass on a certain part of the rev range to work on it. And they zoned in on the area where I felt the bike had trouble, in the kind of lower to mid RPM. Wide open this bike was always good, it pulls like a train, but down low was where I felt it was having a couple of issues. So here you've got Gary probably looking at some fuel ratios. I'm not exactly sure what he's doing here. But by the way, I've seen plenty of dynos in my time. This is the very first time actually spending around a dyno, going through the processes. So I'm by no means an expert to this. If you've got questions, by all means stick them up on the YouTube comments, but the best place to direct them to would be over to Gary himself on his own website. So now look at the graph in the middle, the air to fuel, and you'll see it probably running a little bit high. So really what Gary tells me he's aiming for here is to get that number, that air to fuel ratio, kind of around, in and around the 13:1 rate would be ideal. And it was much lower, the lower part of the revs on the standard map, and higher in the higher part of the revs. So that's really where he spent most of his day, tricking around with the fuel map to try and get it as perfect as possible. The speed restrictor I mentioned was also removed from this, so when we did our final runs they were able to do them in top gear, which is a bit more useful. There are a lot of other things that can be done, but the Tracer didn't actually need them done. So for particular models like a Tenier or some other bikes, they have gear limitations like in first, second and third gear. So those electronic throttle valve restrictions, he's able to strip those out. And in other bikes then where they have like emissions based features, some bikes basically pump in clean air into exhaust jets. I think the power system on a Suzuki or the AIS on a Yamaha, those can also be bypassed through a similar exercise like this, but on the Tracer they weren't really necessary because they're not in place. Remember the speed limiter I mentioned earlier? Well, the next clip you're going to see is actually the bike running through with the speed limiter on earlier, where it was actually, and you may not hear it in the video, but it was kind of bouncing off a ceiling or off a limiter, and then later in the day with it removed, the bike would then rev cleanly past that top speed limiter as well, and onto whatever speed you're willing to hold it wide open to. My main takeaway from today is that a smooth graph is really not a smooth bike, and that's kind of hard to understand why until you start looking at the fuel mixture. And even still I don't fully understand it, but I know riding this bike it is smooth as butter since getting it remapped. And that's why I think it's a difficult service to sell, because you can't see it, you can't feel it other than through the seat of your bike, but it's not a physical thing, it's a real setup thing. So they've got a difficult gig trying to sell these services, but anyway, that's another day's problems. If you're interested in them and you want to see them, that's the improvements on the fuel map. I'll post them up on the website as well if you want to see them in more detail. The dyno that was used was Danny's up in DLM, and the guy doing the work for us was Gary, and you'll get all of his details on mototuning.ie.